Yossi Spiegel, the European Commission is proposing to improve merger regulation and increase controls. Why do you think that is?
These are important factors that show up in real-life cases. And I guess they realized that so far they didn't have the tools to deal with these things in a consistent fashion. So as they pointed out, if there is a merger notification, they look into pre-existing shareholding, and then if they see that something was potentially anti-competitive, they can look into it. But if they did not have the merger notification, these shareholdings will go like under the radar, and they wouldn't even know about them. So I guess they realize that these are important things that they may need to look into, and so far they don't have the tools.
And what are the competitive harms you've identified?
The competitive harms have to do with the fact that once you invest in a rival, even if this is a passive stake, you take into account your own behavior, the effect of your own behavior on the profit of the rival. And so if you compete with a rival, you realize that by competing more aggressively, you divert profits from the rival to you. This is, of course, great for consumers. But if a firm has a stake in the rival, it may be reluctant to divert profits from the rival to itself, because some of these profits the firm has captured anyway, even before the diversion. So obviously, if it doesn't have a stake in the rival, it's more keen to divert profits from the rival to itself by say, competing more aggressively. So having a stake in a rival can soften competition. Soften competition means consumers will get less lucrative offers. And this needs to be looked at. What is interesting is that if you have control, you can affect not only your own strategy, but you can also affect the rival strategy because you control it. If you don't control it, you cannot affect the rival strategy directly, but you can affect your own behavior. And the effect of your own behavior of competition may be detrimental to consumers.
What's been your examination of companies having a range of direct and indirect stakes and that impact on competition?
If you have an industry in which firms are linked to each other via partial ownership, say A has a stake in B, B has a stake in C, C has a stake in A. This can lead to a multiplier effect, meaning that if firm A raises its stake in firm B, say by 10%, the effective stake in B that it gets via this acquisition can be translated to more than 10%, due to the fact that you have a loop. A has a stake in B, B has in C, C has in A, so A has a stake in B not only directly, but also indirectly via its stake in C and so on, and especially if C has a stake in B. So a firm can get direct and indirect ownership stakes, which potentially magnify the stake itself. So in particular, I showed an example in which you have, say, three firms, A, B, and C. They are linked via cross-ownership agreements. And what I showed was that if A gets a share in B, say 10%, given the existing ownership structure that existed even before the acquisition, the actual stake that it buys in B can be much more than 10% due to the existing structure. So directly it buys 10%, but effectively it gets much more than 10%. And so if you look at it naively, you say, well, A has a just acquired 10% stake in B, maybe it's not a big deal. If you ignore the existing ownership structure, you can reach the conclusion that it's only 10% and therefore it's not a cause for alarm. But in fact, if you take into account the existing ownership structure, you may reach a conclusion that it's much more than 10%. And in particular, it might be large and can harm competition. when you examine an acquisition of a passive stake in a rival, you do not need to look at this transaction in isolation, but rather you need to take into account the pre-existing ownership structure, because it can magnify the actual stake which is being acquired. So there is a difference between formally how much you buy versus effectively how much you buy. So this is one thing I emphasized. On top of that, I emphasized that even seemingly small stakes in rivals can translate into a large price increase if there is a pre-existing ownership in the industry. So if A acquires a stake in B, it can have a large price effect. Consumers may end up paying a much higher price if A has a stake in C and C has in B, and so on.
And what are the potential drawbacks you see in the European Commission's initiative?
One of the things that were pointed out during this discussion was that if you require firms to report about acquisitions, there is a cost involved, both for the Commission, because its workload is going to be enhanced, and obviously these things are time consuming, and the Commission has lots of work to do anyway, and it's not obvious that they can handle this bulk of work which will come out of that. It could be very costly for firms, because they would have to supply information, and they would have to dig up the data, and they will have to conduct various analysis. So obviously all of these initiatives can potentially be very costly. So these costs have to be balanced against the benefit. The benefit could be that some harmful transactions will be looked at by the Commission and might be blocked, or the Commission might require some remedies that would otherwise they wouldn't even know about. So obviously one needs to balance the two things.